Just a nurse. That's what Dr. Mercer called her during grand rounds 3 weeks in, his voice carrying the particular disdain reserved for people he'd already decided were beneath him. Natalie Hayes didn't flinch. She stood at the foot of the patient's bed with her hands clasped, her jaw tight, her eyes forward, absorbing every word without a flicker of reaction. That was her strategy, had been her strategy for 8 months at St. Michael's Hospital in San Antonio. Be invisible. Be competent. Be gone by end of shift. She'd managed it until now. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like insects trapped in plastic, casting everything in that particular shade of white that made even healthy people look terminal. Natalie moved through the corridors of the cardiac ward with minimal conversation, her scrubs pristine despite 12-hour shifts, her hand steady on 4 lines and catheter placements. 8 months. 143 days. She'd counted them the way soldiers count down deployments, not because she was eager to leave, but because structure was survival. Structure meant routine. Routine meant nobody asked questions. Nobody dug deeper. Nobody discovered that the woman pushing the med cart at 0400 hours had once carried a 300-pound Army Ranger 3 miles through enemy fire while rounds snapped past her head like angry wasps. That was the old life. This was the cover. Her locker was on the 3rd floor, squeezed between 2 others in the staff break room where nobody lingered. Natalie opened it and checked the small mirror taped inside the door, not to admire herself, but to verify the absence of anything remarkable. Brown eyes. Dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun. No tattoos visible. No scars visible. Just the small faded unit patch sewn into her jacket lining, hidden from view, a thread connecting her to the 12 people who'd become 9. The stitching had started to fray on the left edge. She'd have to reinforce it soon. She washed her hands before her shift, watching the water run clear over her palms. Small scars laddered up her forearms like a topographic map of past decisions, the shrapnel from Loga Province, the knife wound from a medic training accident in 2016, the burn mark from stabilizing a casualty near a burning Humvee in Helmand. Nurses didn't get combat scars. Civilians didn't carry this kind of damage history. She kept her sleeves long. The veterans' ward occupied the East Wing, quieter than the rest of the hospital, filled with men and women whose eyes had seen too much and whose bodies had paid the price for it. Natalie had gravitated toward it immediately, not out of nostalgia, though that was dangerous enough, but because the work felt purposeful in a way the rest of the hospital didn't. These people understood silence. They understood not asking questions. Patient 4-7 occupied room 314, bed nearest the window. He'd been transferred from Brooke Army Medical Center 6 weeks ago, a blind Special Forces soldier evacuated from Kandahar with traumatic optic neuropathy and a list of secondary injuries that would have ended most lives. He'd arrived with nothing except a photograph of his unit and a sister who called twice a week from Austin. Natalie had volunteered for his evening care shift before she'd even processed why. She entered his room at 18:15 hours with his sister's latest letter tucked under her arm. The soldier, she never called him by his name when she could avoid it, was positioned in the wheelchair near the window, his head tilted toward the sound of traffic 8 stories below. His forearm, resting on the armrest, bore a tattoo in block letters, Hayes. Her stomach performed a small, professional lurch every time she saw it. Not Hayes the family name. Hayes the call sign she'd earned when she was something other than a nurse, when her hands had done things that required a name to be anything other than herself. Letter from Sarah, Natalie said, keeping her voice carefully modulated to sound generic, professional, unremarkable. Just a nurse. That was the performance. His head turned toward her voice. The sightlessness was something she'd never quite adjusted to, despite 6 weeks of evening visits, the way his eyes didn't track her movements, the way his gaze settled on empty space slightly to her left. She'd done this to him. Not directly. Not personally. But the weight of that particular debt sat somewhere between her ribs and made breathing harder than it should be. Read it, he said. His voice came from somewhere in his chest, gravelly and trained to carry across distances, across rubble, across the gap between life and death. Same way you always do. She pulled the plastic chair close and unfolded the letter. Sarah wrote the same things every week, whether in Austin, her daughter's school play, the neighbor's unreasonable fence dispute, the dog's arthritis getting worse. Mundane oxygen. Life continuing in the shape of small, manageable problems. Natalie read with the inflection of someone narrating a hospital safety video, draining all emotion from the words because emotion was a luxury and this situation was already expensive enough. When she finished, the soldier was quiet for a long moment. The ventilator in the hallway wheezed its mechanical rhythm, the background soundtrack of the ward. Rain had started hammering the window glass in sheets, the kind of San Antonio downpour that came fast and left everything glittering. "You ever serve?" he asked. It was the third time he'd asked in 6 weeks. The repetition meant he was testing, not just curious. "Just trying to help," Natalie said, which was technically true and completely false simultaneously. "Your vitals are looking better. Blood pressure stable. The physical therapist says your upper body strength is improving." "That's not what I asked." She checked his full line anyway, habit, protocol, the perfect excuse to avoid eye contact. The saline drip was running clear. His skin temperature was normal. Everything was functioning exactly as it should be. She'd been trained to manage broken bodies. Nobody had trained her to manage this particular conversation. "Rest is what you need right now," she said, and turned to go. "Wait." His voice changed pitch, became something she recognized from a different lifetime. "Your hands. When you check my vitals, you move like someone who's done field medicine." The fluorescent lights buzzed. Somewhere down the corridor, a call bell chimed. Natalie stood very still, her hand on the forestand, her composure intact. "Just experience," she said quietly. "Nothing more." She left before he could ask anything else. The next afternoon, Dr. Mercer arrived for rounds with his entourage, 3 residents, 2 medical students, and the particular authority of a man who believed his credentials deserved subservience. He moved through the ward the way generals move through occupied territory, assured of dominion, expecting deference. His eyes found Natalie at the medication cart, and something flickered across his face. Recognition, maybe. Or threat assessment. She was checking patient 47's chart when Mercer pulled it from her hands. "This documentation is sloppy," he said, loud enough for the residents to hear. He was a tall man with the kind of silver temples that looked expensive, the kind of watch that cost more than a used car. Everything about him announced that he'd never been hungry, never been afraid, never had to choose between his pride and his survival. "The vitals are accurate," Natalie said. Her voice stayed level. Her hand stayed open and visible. Just a nurse apologizing for her inadequacy. "The notation here," he pointed with a pen that cost probably $40. "This format is non-standard. We follow protocol at St. Michael's. Perhaps you're used to a less rigorous environment." One of the residents smirked. The medical students exchanged glances. Natalie watched the performance unfold with the detached clarity of someone who'd seen worse theater in interrogation rooms, but the muscle in her jaw tightened regardless. Not from anger. From something older. Something trained out of her in 6 weeks of civilian documentation. "I'll adjust the format," she said. "You should." He handed the chart back to her like she'd failed a basic competency test. "Clinical precision requires attention to detail. You do well to remember that." He moved to patient 47's room with the residents trailing behind him. Natalie remained at the medication cart, her hand still open, her breathing still steady. She had been called worse things by better men. She had survived worse situations with higher stakes. She would survive this. That was the deal she'd made when she took this assignment: survive, document, don't let anyone see the difference between the person pushing the cart and the person who'd once run point for a 3-man fire team through Sanjin Valley. The door to room 314 was open. She could hear Mercer's voice, authoritative and cold. "Patient 47, I'm Dr. Mercer, Chief of Surgery. I'm reviewing your case. It appears your evening nurse has been conducting some unconventional assessments. Has she ever expressed medical opinions beyond standard nursing scope? The blind soldier turned his head toward the doctor's voice. His hands, resting on the wheelchair armrests, gripped tightly. No, he said. She's professional. Well. Mercer's tone carried absolute certainty. Professional or not, we need to ensure nobody's overstepping their credentials around here. Hospital liability is serious business. Natalie stood at the medication cart, her hand frozen on a syringe, her breath controlled and even. In the window's reflection, she could see her own face, composed, neutral, invisible. Just a nurse. That was what everyone saw. That was what had to be true for the mission to continue, for the assignment to hold, for the 8 months of careful invisibility to mean anything. But somewhere in room 314, a blind soldier whose forearm bore her name was listening to a doctor interrogate his care, and something in the carefully constructed architecture of her civilian identity began to show cracks. The rain continued hammering against the windows. Nobody else seemed to notice the temperature had changed in the hallway, that the air had become something denser, something waiting. It wasn't a request. It was a warning. The conference room at St. Michael's held 24 people that morning, and Dr. Mercer arranged them like a choreography of power. 12 residents in the front row, their white coats pristine and creased, still believing credentials were armor. For attending physicians flanking him, allies or at minimum, witnesses. 8 nurses clustered near the door, there to learn, there to absorb the hierarchy. The fluorescent panels cast everything in institutional white, making the room feel less like medicine and more like a courtroom. Dr. Mercer pulled up Natalie's charting on the projector. Her documentation filled the screen, meticulous, precise, the charting of someone who'd learned to document what mattered and what could kill you. He clicked to a post-op antibiotic order he'd written for a routine appendectomy. Standard second-generation cephalosporin. Natalie had documented a question, patient allergy to penicillin derivatives, cross-reactivity risk to cephalosporins. Request clarification before administration. Let's discuss Nurse Hayes' documentation, Dr. Mercer said, his voice pitched to sound professorial, which meant deliberately patronizing. Notice the questioning of my antibiotic selection here. Notice the confidence in her clinical judgment. He turned to face the room, leaving the slide on the projector like an indictment. Natalie stood against the back wall, near the door but not blocking it, positioning that said I don't belong here but won't retreat. Her hands clasped at her waist. Her jaw tight enough that someone watching closely would see the muscle clench, release, clench again. Her eyes fixed on a point above his head, somewhere near the corner where the ceiling met the wall. This is what happens, Dr. Mercer continued, when people think experience replaces education. When clinical intuition substitutes for medical knowledge. It's dangerous. It erodes the chain of command. He paused. So tell me, Nurse Hayes, when did you get your MD? The room went so quiet you could hear the air conditioning hum through the vents. Laughter came first, scattered and nervous, residents glancing at each other to see if it was safe to find this funny. A senior attending chuckled, louder than the others, which gave everyone permission. The laughter built, not cruel exactly, but performative, the kind of laughter that exists to show you're on the right side of power. Natalie didn't move. Didn't blink. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was the iron discipline of someone who'd carried wounded soldiers through Taliban fire and learned that reaction is information the enemy can use. Her chest rose and fell with measured breaths. Military breathing. Box breathing, 4 counts in, 4 counts hold, 4 counts out. The only concession to the violence of the moment. We have a nickname for nurses who think they're doctors, Dr. Mercer said, his voice dropping into that register meant to sound confidential, like he was sharing wisdom with the residents. We call them liabilities. We call them dangerous. He smiled. And dangerous people don't belong in teaching hospitals. The words hung there, and Natalie felt them settle like shrapnel, designed to fragment, designed to wound in ways that wouldn't show on initial assessment. One of the residents shifted his weight. A female attending physician frowned slightly, something flickering across her face that might have been recognition of a line being crossed. But no one spoke. No one stood. That was the architecture of it. Build the power high enough and everyone underneath stays still. Dr. Mercer clicked to the next slide. Another chart. Another moment where Natalie's documentation suggested she'd noticed something her superior had missed. Later, near the third-floor vending machines, the smell of burnt coffee and stale air, Natalie approached two nurses she'd personally trained 6 months prior. Sarah and Michelle. She'd spent for hours with each of them, teaching for insertion technique, femoral lines, the anatomy of the neck and arm, the muscle memory that turns panic into competence. They'd both cried when they got their first line. Both said they couldn't have done it without her. Now they were whispering near the Doritos. When they saw her approaching, the whispers stopped like a switch. "Hey," Natalie said, "just that." Her voice came out calm, the deferential tone of someone still playing at belonging. "You guys doing okay?" Sarah looked at Michelle. Michelle looked away. "Did you hear what Dr. Mercer said about Hayes in grand rounds?" Sarah said, not to Natalie but to Michelle, loud enough that Natalie was meant to hear. "About thinking she knows better than surgeons." They turned then. Both of them. Sarah gave a tight smile that wasn't a smile at all. "We probably shouldn't be seen together much." "You know?" "Since?" She trailed off, which was worse than finishing. "Yeah," Michelle said. "We have to be careful about our reputations too." They left together, shoulders angled away from her, moving back toward the units, back toward where Dr. Mercer's version of them was already spreading. Natalie stood in front of the vending machine, hand on the selector for black coffee she wouldn't drink. She could taste the mission unraveling like old fabric. That evening, Dr. Mercer caught her in the hallway outside patient for 7's room. The veteran was asleep inside, his sightless eyes moving beneath closed lids, dreaming of something or someone. Natalie had been about to enter with the evening reports when Dr. Mercer appeared, his presence like a pressure change, the kind that precedes weather. "You spend a lot of time with the veteran," he said. Not a question. A statement with teeth. Natalie turned to face him, the hallway suddenly feeling smaller. Hospital sounds faded to background, the distant beep of monitors, the soft squeak of wheels somewhere on the unit, the hiss of air from climate control. "Standard patient care," she said. Her voice had dropped lower, something she'd controlled. "You're playing hero." He moved closer, not threatening physical contact but making his presence impossible to ignore. "Some people need to remember their place. Their actual place." He paused. "One more questioning of my orders. One more chart note that suggests you know better. And security will escort you out of this hospital. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" She met his eyes then. That was the mistake she made, the one thing that flickered across his face, surprised that she wasn't looking away, wasn't ashamed, wasn't performing fear. For just a moment, she wasn't a nurse being corrected. Something else looked back at him. Something with depth. She nodded once. "Good," he said, satisfied now that the visual cue was there. "Glad we understand each other." He walked away, his shoes clicking against the tile with the rhythm of someone accustomed to floors parting for him. Natalie's hand moved to her scrub pocket, where she kept a piece of frayed cloth sewn into the lining. A faded unit patch from the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, a dark horse. She'd carried it from Kandahar sewn inside her jacket, against her chest for 2 tours and 3 operations. The patch was so worn the colors had blurred, the stitching coming loose at one corner. She touched it now like a prayer, though she hadn't prayed since before the first ambush. Over the next 3 weeks, Dr. Mercer built his documentation trail with the precision of someone constructing a case against an adversary. The first incident report landed in her personnel file on Monday. Nurse Hayes questioned surgical residents' post-operative orders in front of patient, directly undermining medical authority and causing patient anxiety. It was dated and stamped and copied to hospital administration. It was also a lie refracted through the lens of interpretation. She had asked a question. Questions were dangerous to people like Mercer. The second report came on Wednesday. Nurse Hayes accessed patient files outside assigned unit without authorization. Security breach concerning. Recommend disciplinary review. She had accessed patient for Seven's pre-admission medical records from his military service, looking for intel on the supply chain he'd testified about before his injury, looking for names and dates and units, intelligence that mattered for the operation. That access was noted, filed, weaponized. The third report, filed the following Monday, was the most insidious. Nurse Hayes demonstrated insubordination by refusing to administer medication as prescribed, citing contraindication not recognized by attending physician. She had refused to give a beta blocker to a patient with a documented penicillin allergy, not the drug that was contraindicated, but the patient was hypertensive from infection, and she'd recognized a cross-reaction risk that Mercer's order didn't account for. She'd been right. The allergy documentation proved it. But in his version, she was the problem. The insubordinate one. The one who couldn't follow orders. Each form was filed with the director of nursing, each one copied to the hospital's credentialing office, each one stamped and dated and added to the permanent record. He invoked policies by number, 7.3.2 regarding scope of practice, Section 12 addressing chain of command, Regulation for 40 about professional conduct. The language of bureaucracy, which moved slower than a syringe but with the precision of a surgical blade. The director of nursing called Natalie into her office on a Thursday morning. Large window overlooking San Antonio, the city spread out like something that had nothing to do with what was happening in this room. "I'm getting complaints," the director said. "Not unkind, but not sympathetic either. Multiple. From Dr. Mercer specifically. He's expressing concern about your professional judgment. Your attitude." She adjusted her glasses. "Dr. Mercer is chief of surgery. He's been here 8 years. You've been here 8 months. I need you to be more cooperative." Natalie kept her voice level. "I'm providing standard patient care. Are you?" The director opened her file. "Because Dr. Mercer seems to think you're overstepping. That you're not respecting the chain of command." That night, sitting in her car in the parking garage, Natalie made the call to her handler. The parking structure echoed with her voice, empty at 2,300 hours except for a few vehicles scattered across levels. Her phone was encrypted, the line routed through 3 countries, the conversation theoretically invisible. "Cover is compromised," she said. "Multiple incident reports filed. Hospital administration is aware. Recommend extraction." The handler's response came back within seconds. They were always monitoring when the operation was hot. Negative. Patient for T7 is critical witness to supply chain. Medical equipment disappearing through this hospital's logistics, possibly funding extremist cells. You're our only embedded asset with access. I'm about to be fired. Then don't get fired. A pause. You've survived worse. Maintain position. The line went dead. Natalie sat in the darkness of the parking garage, her hand on the unit patch through her scrub pocket, feeling the rough texture of fabric that had traveled further than most people traveled in a lifetime. The mission came first. It always had. It always would. Even when it cost her everything. The next morning, Dr. Mercer passed her in the hallway and didn't acknowledge her? That was the new language, not overt cruelty but the violence of erasure. By afternoon, 3 nurses who'd previously asked her opinion on difficult patients stopped seeking her input. By evening, an opportunity to assist in the surgical suite for a teaching case went to someone else, the scheduling coordinator offering an excuse that wasn't an explanation. The poison was in the bloodstream now, spreading through the staff like sepsis, invisible but unstoppable. The manila folder landed on Natalie's locker with a soft thud on Tuesday morning. She didn't open it immediately. She knew what it contained before she pulled the metal clasp free, an incident report dated 3 days prior, Dr. Mercer's handwriting precise and clinical as a scalpel. Nurse Hayes questioned surgical residents' post-op orders in front of patient, the summary read. Demonstrates pattern of challenging medical judgment without clinical authority. Created anxiety in patient and undermined physician leadership. She'd been in the room when it happened. The resident had written vancomycin dosing for a 47-year-old cardiac patient with stage 3 kidney disease, a dose that would accumulate to toxic levels in 72 hours. Natalie had spoken quietly, respectfully. Renal dosing adjustment. That was all. The resident had nodded, corrected it, thanked her. The patient hadn't even noticed. Dr. Mercer had noticed. He'd been standing in the doorway, watching, and he'd been waiting for exactly this moment. She closed the locker. The sound of metal meeting metal echoed through the pre-dawn nursing station like a gunshot in a canyon. 2 nurses who'd been restocking the medication cart didn't look up. They didn't need to. The poison was already in their bloodstream now, invisible but moving through their veins like sepsis, spreading from one conversation to the next, in the break room, outside the supply closet, in the parking lot after shift change. Natalie Hayes questioned authority. Natalie Hayes made residents look bad. Natalie Hayes was the problem. By Wednesday afternoon, the written warning arrived in her personnel file. That was the escalation. Not a conversation. Not a meeting with HR where she could explain context or defend the accuracy of the incident report. Just a document, officially stamped, officially permanent. The warning cited pattern of insubordination and failure to maintain appropriate professional boundaries with medical staff. The language was surgical, each phrase carefully chosen to convey instability, judgment issues, potential danger to the organization. It wasn't about one dosing question anymore. It was about her character. It was about her fitness to practice. Natalie had seen this before. She'd seen career soldiers face the same institutional machinery, documentation that twisted context until innocent actions looked like deliberate misconduct, each new piece of paper building a case that would eventually justify whatever outcome had been decided long before the file was opened. This was how organizations killed people quietly. Not with explosions. With paperwork. She found patient 4-7 in his room that evening, his head turned toward the window even though he couldn't see the sunset bleeding orange and red across the Texas sky. She read him a letter from his sister in her steady voice, the same voice she used during every evening visit, the voice that didn't crack or waver no matter what had happened that day. His hand found hers on the mattress rail. He didn't say anything. They never did, not about the important things. But his thumb pressed once against her palm in the old code from Kandahar, confirm, ready, acknowledged. She pressed back. The formal complaint to the state licensing board arrived on Friday morning. This was the turning point, the moment when internal hospital politics transformed into professional regulation warfare. Dr. Mercer had escalated beyond St. Michael's entirely, weaponizing the Texas Medical Board itself, an institution with the power to suspend her license, to end her career permanently, to investigate claims that could take months to disprove. The complaint alleged unsafe nursing practice, failure to recognize scope of practice limitations, and repeated interference with physician decision-making that placed patients at risk. 8 pages. 17 specific incidents. 6 of them had never happened. 3 of them were grotesque misrepresentations of actual events. 8 of them were real but stripped of all context that would have explained her actions as medically sound. She read it 3 times in the bathroom stall during her lunch break, the fluorescent lights casting shadows that made her hands look like they belonged to someone else. She'd served 18 years. 3 tours in special forces. 67 combat operations. Decorated for valor. And now a physician who didn't respect her clinical judgment was building a case to have her license suspended in the state where she'd worked for 8 months. The mathematics of it was clear. 3 weeks from now, the licensing board would contact her for a response. She would have 30 days to prepare a written rebuttal. During that time, Dr. Mercer would continue documenting incidents, real or invented, it didn't matter. The institution would protect one of its own. A physician was worth more than a nurse. A surgeon was worth exponentially more than a floor nurse with experience but no letters after her name. And Natalie couldn't reveal why she was actually at St. Michael's without exposing an active intelligence operation. She couldn't defend herself without compromising the mission. That was the leverage. That was the trap. On Saturday evening, Natalie received the email from the surgical scheduler. Patient 47 was scheduled for a routine bronchoscopy on Monday morning at 0700 to address persistent pneumonia in his left lower lobe. The original pulmonologist, Dr. Chen, who'd worked with the patient twice before and had established a careful rapport, had been reassigned to the ICU. Dr. Mercer had personally requested the transfer. He would be the attending for the procedure instead. Natalie sat on her couch in the darkened apartment and didn't move for 40 minutes. The faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, the one from her team in Kandahar, the one with 12 names that had become 9, hung in the bedroom closet. She never looked at it directly anymore. The weight of it was enough. She always felt the weight. The mission was deteriorating. That was the operational assessment. Dr. Mercer's campaign had accomplished exactly what it was designed to accomplish. It had created enough doubt, enough documentation, enough institutional pressure that her ability to operate independently was compromised. She couldn't access certain supply chain records anymore without triggering IT alerts. She couldn't observe certain procedures without people watching her for signs of overreach. She'd become visible in all the wrong ways. And a visible asset wasn't useful. A visible asset was a liability. Monday morning arrived clear and hot, the San Antonio sun already brutal by 0600. Natalie arrived at the pre-op area at 06:45 and began preparing patient 47 for the bronchoscopy with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this hundreds of times. She checked his vitals. His oxygen saturation was 94% on room air, which was acceptable. But his breathing was more labored than usual, his right side moving less than his left. She'd worked trauma long enough to recognize the subtle language of an underlying problem, the way the body whispers before it screams. She documented it. Patient reports increased dyspnea on exertion this weekend. Right-sided breath sounds diminished. Elevated work of breathing at baseline. She flagged it to the surgical team, her voice level and professional, no edge of alarm. Just data. Just information. Dr. Mercer glanced at the documentation and dismissed it without reading the full note. He's anxious. Preoperative jitters. We proceed as scheduled. Natalie lowered her voice. His trachea is deviating slightly to the left. Combined with decreased right-sided breath sounds, this could indicate pneumonia progressing toward. Are you the physician here, Nurse Hayes? No? Then prepare the patient and step back. His voice carried the particular cruelty of someone who didn't need to raise his voice to cut someone down. It was a public moment, 3 residents witnessing it, their faces already arranging themselves into the careful blankness that meant they were watching, absorbing the pecking order. She was being put in her place. She was being diminished in front of an audience. She prepared the patient anyway. Her hands moved through the sequence with the precision of 18 years, full line, monitoring pads, oxygen line, sedation protocol. She didn't look at Dr. Mercer. She didn't argue. She simply noted everything in the chart with meticulous clarity, in language that would be unambiguous if anyone ever had reason to review this day. Patient 47 was wheeled into the procedure room at 0710. Natalie positioned herself outside the window, a violation of protocol. Procedure rooms were restricted to necessary personnel, but the door window was small and she was standing in the hallway, not technically in the room. She wasn't technically doing anything wrong. She was simply standing in a place where she could see through glass. The procedure began. The anesthesiologist confirmed sedation. The endotracheal tube slid into place. Dr. Mercer advanced the bronchoscope with the casual confidence of someone who'd performed this procedure 1,000 times, someone who didn't second-guess his own judgment. And then, at 14 minutes into the procedure, patient 47's oxygen saturation began dropping. 94, 89, 82, 75. His chest was rising asymmetrically. One side rising, the other barely moving. The breathing pattern that Natalie had seen in field conditions before, intense under mortar fire, in helicopters crossing hostile territory, the pattern that meant the lungs were collapsing on one side, meant the heart was being compressed, meant that if nothing changed in the next 90 seconds, cardiac arrest would follow. Tension pneumothorax. A collapsed lung compressing the mediastinum and compressing the heart. The pressure building inside the thoracic cavity with nowhere to escape. Dr. Mercer's hands went still. She could see it through the glass, his hands hovering over the scope, his face going pale beneath the surgical mask, the exact moment when competence transformed into paralysis. He didn't know what to do. The protocol required needle decompression, a 14-gauge angiocath needle driven between the second and third ribs at the midclavicular line. It was a procedure he'd probably never had to perform in his career. It was a procedure that belonged to trauma medicine, not elective surgery. It was a procedure that Captain Natalie Hayes had performed in the dark on the outskirts of Kandahar with a combat knife and her own blood on her hands. The anesthesiologist called for help. "We're losing him." SATS in the 60s. The door to the procedure room was locked. Standard protocol. Natalie could have rung the intercom. She could have requested entry. She could have followed procedure, waited, trusted the system that had already demonstrated it would choose Dr. Mercer's pride over her patient's life. She didn't follow procedure. She didn't ring the intercom. She exploded through the door like the hinges were an insurgent position and she was clearing a hostile room, her shoulder meeting the frame with the force that came from 18 years of muscle memory, from being tired of doing things the way they wanted her to do them. The stretcher rolled through the bronchoscopy suite at 8:41 a.m. Patient 4-7 lay supine, already sedated, his sightless eyes closed beneath a mask delivering pre-oxygenation. Routine procedure, the chart said. Persistent pneumonia. Diagnostic bronchoscopy, standard protocol, low-risk intervention. The kind of case that filled 3 slots in a surgical schedule and generated billing codes that made hospital administrators smile. Natalie stood at the head of the bed in her scrubs, hand steady on the 4-pole, watching the monitors paint their familiar green lines across black screens. Heart rate 64. Blood pressure 118/74. Oxygen saturation 98% on supplemental flow. Beautiful vitals. Patient 4-7 was stable, almost peaceful in his unconsciousness, his breathing synchronized with the ventilator's mechanical rhythm like a metronome counting down to something neither of them could see. Dr. Mercer entered through the double doors with the momentum of someone accustomed to moving through rooms like he owned the building's deed. He was supposed to be in surgery, a partial gastrectomy on the 4th floor, scheduled for 8:30, a case he'd been discussing with residents for the past week as an opportunity to teach proper technique to people who actually understand the importance of hierarchy. But here he was, stripped down to surgical scrubs, his mask dangling around his neck like a stethoscope worn by someone who'd forgotten what it was for. "I'll be attending on this case," he announced to the surgical nurses prepping instruments. Not a request. Not a question. It wasn't a request. It was a command. The statement hung in the air like the smell of antiseptic, clinical and absolute. The senior surgical nurse, Martinez, who'd been doing bronchoscopies since before Dr. Mercer earned his medical degree, looked up from the instrument tray with the expression of someone watching a chess player move into a position that made no strategic sense. Dr. Hutchins was scheduled as attending, she said, her voice flat and professional. "Dr. Hutchins has been reassigned," Dr. Mercer replied, already moving to the sink, pulling on sterile gloves with the kind of aggressive precision that made the latex snap like gunfire. He didn't make eye contact with Natalie, but she felt the weight of his attention anyway, the way a predator feels the presence of prey even in peripheral vision. She'd seen this before, in operating rooms where ego and opportunity intersected, where a surgeon with something to prove would engineer a crisis just to demonstrate his brilliance in resolving it. The bronchoscope was already prepared, a flexible fiber optic instrument with a working channel for biopsies, suction, and medication delivery. Patient 4-7 was breathing peacefully, trusting the machines and the hands that controlled them, unaware that the man about to examine his lungs had already rehearsed this moment in his mind like a conductor preparing for a performance he desperately needed to nail. The first camera angle showed clear airways, normal bronchial branching, the lungs expanding with textbook symmetry as the ventilator delivered each breath. Dr. Mercer worked methodically, advancing the scope deeper, narrating his findings in the clinical monotone that residents learned to recognize as confidence disguised as education. Normal mucosa. No hemorrhage. Clear secretions. Proceeding to left lower lobe for targeted visualization. His hands moved with technical competence. He was a surgeon, after all, skilled enough to be dangerous, skilled enough that people had followed his orders without question for 15 years. But there was something in his body language that Natalie recognized from her training, from the tactical awareness that kept soldiers alive in hostile environments. He was hunting for something. Not medically. Politically. Some small finding, some minor pathology that he could blow up into significance, some reason to call for emergency intervention that would position him as the hero saving the day from a mistake made by someone else, someone like Natalie Hayes, who'd prepared the patient, who'd maintained the airway, who'd been present for every second of this procedure except the ones that mattered most. The bronchoscope advanced deeper. Patient 4-7's oxygen saturation remained stable. His heart rate steady. The machines sang their comfortable electronic song, beep, whoosh, beep, the sound of a body working exactly as designed. And then something shifted. Not a noise. Not a visible change on the monitors. Just a feeling, the way a pilot knows an engine is failing before the gauges register the drop, the way a medic in the field knows a soldier is going into shock before the blood pressure falls. Natalie's hands tightened on the 4-pole. Her eyes flicked to the pressure monitor. Still normal. Still perfect. Still wrong. The patient's left shoulder rotated inward. Subtle. Almost imperceptible. Muscle tension that meant something in his chest was changing state, that his lungs were reorganizing themselves around an event the mechanical eyes hadn't registered yet. She'd seen this movement before, in a dust-covered tent in Sanjin Valley, in a medevac helicopter somewhere over Helmand Province, in the moment before a soldier stopped breathing because the pressure inside his chest was compressing his lungs into failure. Tension pneumothorax. The bronchoscope. Dr. Mercer must have perforated the pleural membrane with the scope's tip during his advance, puncturing the barrier between the lung and the chest wall. Air was leaking into the space between the lung and the rib cage, building pressure with each breath the ventilator delivered, compressing the left lung down into a collapsed remnant, compressing the heart, restricting blood flow, killing the patient in the time it took for a monitor to register the change. For seconds. 5. The oxygen saturation began to drop. 98 to 96. 96 to 94. The curve on the monitor steepened like a ski slope, and Dr. Mercer's hands went rigid. Not frozen. Rigid. The way a person freezes when they've been trained to respond but their training is theoretical, clinical, divorced from the reality of a human being dying in front of them in real time. He pulled the bronchoscope back. Wrong move. The scope was no longer the problem, the air leak was the problem, and air didn't care whether the scope was present or absent. The oxygen saturation continued its descent. 94 to 92. His mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. We need to. He started, his voice carrying the tone of a man reading a script that was written in a language he no longer remembered. We need to wait for trauma response. We need to. The oxygen saturation hit 88. Patient 4-7's heart rate climbed to 142. The blood pressure plummeted as his heart, compressed by the pneumothorax, struggled to pump blood against the force of air that shouldn't exist. 82 over 51. 78 over 48. The patient's skin was turning the color of old concrete, his lips darkening as the oxygen molecules that his body desperately needed passed through lungs that no longer functioned. This was the moment where training fractured into reality. This was the moment where a surgeon either became the emergency or became the obstacle. Dr. Mercer stood motionless, the bronchoscope still in his hand, his eyes fixed on the monitor with the expression of someone watching a disaster on a screen, present but not participating, conscious but not acting. The procedure room door exploded inward. Natalie moved like air pressure finding release, her body crossing the space between the door and the patient in 4 strides that carried the momentum of 18 years compressed into 4 seconds. Her hand went to the instrument tray without looking, without thinking, her fingers recognizing the weight and shape of the scalpel before her conscious mind caught up with what her muscle memory had already decided. Tension pneumothorax, left side, she said, her voice dropping into a register that didn't belong in a hospital, that belonged in a forward operating base or a dust-filled compound where people either obeyed immediately or people died. He's got 3 minutes. The scalpel moved like it had somewhere to be. Second intercostal space, midclavicular line. She didn't have time for ultrasound or careful measurement, just the anatomy that lived in her hands like a second language. Skin incision, the blade sliding through dermis with the kind of confident violence that only came from having done it while rounds were going out overhead and sand was in the wound and a soldier's eyes were already starting to glaze. Dr. Mercer stammered something about trauma teams and waiting protocols, but his words were happening in a dimension she'd already left. Blunt dissection through the pectoralis major muscle, fingers following the scalpel's path, creating the channel. The needle driver was in her other hand. How did it get there? Who picked it up? Did one of the nurses move, or was she moving in some kind of coordinated swarm intelligence? Puncture through the pleura. And then the sound that meant life instead of death. The hiss. The beautiful, horrible hiss of air escaping, the sound of pressure releasing, the physical manifestation of a body no longer crushing itself from the inside. Patient for 7's oxygen saturation stopped falling. 45 seconds from incision to decompression. Suction, Natalie said, and someone, Martinez, definitely Martinez, who'd recognized authority when she heard it, placed the suction catheter in her palm before the word had even finished leaving her mouth. Blood and air cleared from the surgical field. The lung re-expanded like someone taking their first real breath after nearly drowning. Oxygen saturation began climbing. 88 to 90. 90 to 94. 94 to 98. The heart rate started its descent from tachycardia back toward normal. The blood pressure rose like a tide reversing. The monitors sang their electronic song again, beep, whoosh, beep, and the patient whose name no one had said out loud but who was patient 4 to 7, who was a blind soldier, who was a man whose life had been suspended in the space between breathing and not breathing for 90 seconds that felt like 90 minutes, that patient was back. He was alive. He was back. The room went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights hum their 60 Hz monotone above the sudden absence of emergency. Natalie's hands dropped to her sides. The scalpel was still in her right hand. She became aware of it the way a person becomes aware of a weapon after violence has stopped, suddenly present in a way it hadn't been moments before. Dr. Mercer's face was the color of old medical equipment, his mouth working silently, his eyes fixed on the patient who was breathing, who should have been dead, who was not dead because a nurse had committed a violation so profound that it exceeded his authority to ignore it. "Everyone out," he said, his voice carrying no force, no command structure, just the exhausted directionality of a person who was holding onto hierarchy the way a drowning man holds onto driftwood. "Nurse Hayes, do not move." The other surgical personnel filed out with the cautious movements of people departing a scene where the wrong words could change their career trajectory. Martinez paused at the door, glanced back at Natalie with an expression that was equal parts gratitude and knowing, and then the door closed. Natalie stood alone in the procedure room with Dr. Mercer and the patient whose lungs were now expanding and contracting with beautiful, unforced rhythm. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then Dr. Mercer moved toward the computer terminal where the incident report form was already loading. She could see him typing before she could process that he was typing, his fingers flying across the keyboard like he was trying to outrun what had just happened. "Gross violation of scope of practice," he muttered, not looking up. "Unauthorized invasive procedure. Patient endangerment. Reckless disregard for protocol." The words appeared on the screen like he was reading them from scripture. By 11:56 a.m., the formal complaint was filed with the Texas Board of Nursing. By end of shift, a written warning was in her personnel file, signed and dated, with language that made it clear she was now marked territory. Anyone advocating for her was putting their own career in the line of fire. By the time the sun set on that day, she knew with the certainty that only comes from having survived combat that everything was about to collapse. The termination letter arrived 2 days later. Pattern of insubordination and repeated violations of hospital policy necessitate immediate termination, effective immediately. Return all hospital property to security. She didn't argue. She didn't fight. She couldn't reveal the truth without blowing the intelligence operation she'd been embedded in for 8 months, without compromising the investigation into the medical supply diversion ring that Dr. Mercer hadn't even known existed. Her handler's message came through encrypted text: "Mission terminated. Cover blown by protocol violation. Extraction complete. Your service is noted. Clinical. Cold. Professional." The words of a military intelligence officer who understood that sometimes soldiers had to choose between saving someone and staying invisible. She chose. She always chose. Her locker was empty within an hour. A chipped mug that read "World's Okayest Nurse" in fading letters. A half-dead succulent that she'd been meaning to kill for 3 months anyway. A photograph of her unit from before Kandahar, 12 faces arranged in formation, 3 of them now crossed out in her private accounting, the ones who didn't make it back. And underneath her jacket lining, where it had lived since the day she left Fort Bragg, the faded Special Forces unit patch that nobody would ever salute because nobody knew it was there. At the bus stop in the rain, cardboard box balanced on her lap, Natalie Hayes sat in the kind of darkness that only comes when everything you built gets taken away in a single incident report. The rain hammered the parking lot like applause from an audience she'd never hear. She opened the photograph. 12. 3. 9. The math of survival that nobody taught you in medical school or basic training, or the 18 years that landed between those 2 starting points. Patient 47 was alive. That was the only math that mattered. That was the only math that had ever mattered. Tomorrow everything would change again. But tonight, in the rain, she held the photograph and counted the faces that were left. The room went dead silent. Natalie crossed the procedure space in 4 strides. Her hands moved before her mind caught up, muscle memory from 17 times under fire in Kandahar sandstorms, from nights when the only light was tracer rounds and the only sound was the hiss of a pneumothorax killing a soldier in real time. She didn't ask permission. She didn't reach for a surgical tray. She pulled the combat knife from her boot, the one she'd carried through 2 tours, the blade as familiar as her own heartbeat, and made the incision at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, exactly where anatomy and physics said the air pocket was suffocating James Morrison's lung. The hiss came next. Air escaping. Pressure releasing. Death postponing itself for another 90 seconds. Dr. Mercer's face drained of color. His mouth opened and closed like a fish on a dock. The surgical residents froze mid-breath. The attending anesthesiologist stared at the monitor as oxygen saturation began its climb: 68, 72, 79, 86. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, pushing air into lungs that were finally getting room to expand. Natalie didn't stop. Her hands were steady as surgical lasers. She threaded a 14-gauge angiocath needle into the opening she'd created, converting an emergency knife incision into a proper chest tube in movement so fluid and precise that one of the residents would later describe it as watching someone play a piece of music they'd memorized 15 years ago. Sinus rhythm stabilized on the monitor. Blood pressure climbed from 64/40 to 91/58. James Morrison's blind eyes flickered open behind his sedation mask, and his hand reached toward the sound of her voice without being told why. 90 seconds. That was all it had taken to do what Dr. Mercer couldn't: save a soldier's life while the man with the credentials stood paralyzed at the foot of the bed. The silence afterward was the kind that breaks people. Dr. Mercer recovered first. Not his composure, that was gone, replaced by the thin red line of his mouth and the way his left eye twitched slightly, but his instinct for self-preservation. He stepped back from the monitor. He straightened his surgical cap. He caught the eye of the senior resident and gave a small nod that meant nothing and everything: document everything, protect the hierarchy, the story we tell begins right now. By that evening, the incident report was filed. Gross violation of scope of practice. Unauthorized medical intervention. Potential negligence resulting in trauma to the patient during emergency procedure. The language was precise, bureaucratic, surgical in its own way. It didn't mention that James Morrison's oxygen saturation had been 58% when Natalie's knife broke his skin. It didn't mention that Dr. Mercer had been frozen. It didn't mention the 87 times in medical literature where field thoracotomies performed by trained personnel in emergencies had saved lives that standard protocol would have lost. The written warning came 3 weeks later. It arrived in Natalie's inbox, carbon copies to Human Resources and the State Nursing Board. The language escalated: pattern of insubordination, failure to respect chain of command, unauthorized assumption of physician duties. Dr. Mercer had made calls. Natalie could trace them like blood in water. The chief of surgery had received a personal visit. The hospital's legal department had been consulted. Someone in the state medical board's office, someone who owed Dr. Mercer a favor or feared him or simply trusted that a man with his credentials wouldn't lie, had flagged her file for review. The licensing board complaint arrived in manila envelope, official seal on the front, her name in the address line written by someone whose job it was to deliver these things without reading them. It cited gross violation of scope of practice, unauthorized medical intervention, potential danger to patients, and pattern of behavior inconsistent with nursing standards. The board would review within 30 days. There would be a hearing. She would need to retain legal representation. 6 weeks of bureaucratic warfare, each document more damaging than the last, each one reducing 18 years of service to a personnel file that read like a danger to public health. Dr. Mercer hadn't needed to touch her directly. The machinery of institutions was his weapon. Hierarchy was his armor. The fact that she'd saved a life, the fact that she'd done exactly what she'd been trained to do, didn't matter. What mattered was that she'd made him look small in front of residents, and there were protocols for destroying people who did that. The termination letter came on a Thursday afternoon. Termination of employment effective immediately. Cause, pattern of insubordination and unauthorized medical procedures. Final paycheck will be mailed. Hospital badge, return to security. Please vacate hospital premises within 1 hour. Security walked her out. Not hostile, just present. A young man in a uniform, probably 23, who looked at his shoes the entire walk from the third-floor nursing station to the ground-floor exit. Her cardboard box held the things that 8 months of cover identity had accumulated: a chipped mug that read "World's Okayest Nurse," a gift from James Morrison before the blindness, before the surgery, before everything changed. A half-dead succulent she'd kept on her locker shelf, brown at the edges, surviving on hospital bathroom tap water like everything else in this building that wasn't supposed to be here. A photograph of her unit before Kandahar. 12 faces. 3 tours forward, 2 tours back, and she was the only one in the picture who'd come home with all her limbs and most of her mind still intact. The rain in San Antonio that evening was warm and heavy, the kind of rain that felt personal. Natalie sat at the bus stop with her cardboard box, the mug visible at the top because the box was half falling apart, because nothing in her life right now seemed engineered to hold together. She couldn't tell anyone the truth. She couldn't call her handler and explain that Dr. Mercer had destroyed her cover. She couldn't report that the medical supply diversion ring she'd been placed at St. Michael's to monitor, the extremist funding pipeline, the black market pharmaceuticals, the whole operation she'd documented over 6 months of silent observation, was now inaccessible because she'd blown the entire mission to save a blind soldier's life. That was what nobody understood. Not the hospital. Not the licensing board. Not the bureaucrats who'd signed off on her termination. She'd been supposed to be invisible. She'd been supposed to document, observe, collect evidence, disappear into the machinery without ever revealing what she was. The intelligence operation had a timeline. 6 more weeks and the arrests would happen. 3 weeks after that and the funding would be cut. But she'd broken the timeline the moment she picked up that knife. Her phone had no messages. Her handler couldn't contact her, not through official channels. The mission was gone. The cover was gone. She sat in the rain with a cardboard box and a half-dead plant and a photograph of 9 soldiers who didn't come home, and the thing nobody could see was that she didn't regret it. James Morrison was alive because she'd chosen the human in front of her over the intelligence operation, the mission, the timeline, the directive. She'd chosen 8 months of invisible work to be worth nothing because 90 seconds of visible action was worth everything. The rain hammered the bus stop shelter like applause from a crowd that didn't exist. She had no idea what was about to walk through the hospital doors tomorrow. She had no idea that Miguel was already holding a shadow box. She had no idea that a 2-star general was in transit, or that someone in that procedure room had recorded the entire thing, or that by morning her name would be tied to a call sign that only 7 people in the world still remembered, Reaper 6. She had no idea that the girl who'd gone invisible in a hospital was about to become the most visible person in San Antonio's recent memory. All she knew was that she'd made the choice, and she'd make it again, and if that meant losing her nursing license and her cover and 6 months of work, then that was the cost of being human in a place where being human wasn't in the job description. The bus approached. The rain kept falling. She picked up the cardboard box and stood, ready to disappear one more time, not knowing that disappearing wasn't an option anymore. If you made it this far, you know that the quietest people in the room are often the ones holding everything together. Subscribe for more stories like Natalie's, stories about the ones who sacrifice everything in silence, and the moments when their truth finally comes to light. What would you have done in her position? Drop a comment and let me know. And if you believe the system failed her, hit that like button.